Imani Rauso stared at the glowing digits on her smartphone, watching the call timer finally freeze. 50 minutes. 50 minutes of navigating the razor-thin edge of a multi-billion-dollar waterfront briefing with Han Yi-kyung, the man the underworld called the Glacier of Soul, and the man she called Sir with a terrifyingly steady voice. Her fingers, slim and elegant against the sleek device, were still trembling. Is he finally off the line? Her associate, Maya, whispered from the drafting table, her voice barely audible over the hum of the architectural firm's ventilation. Imani nodded, a long, shaky exhale escaping her as she collapsed into her ergonomic chair. Across from her, the sleek glass walls of the studio reflected a team of designers who looked like they had just survived a high-velocity collision. That voice, though, Jordan, the junior architect, muttered while fanning himself with a blueprint. Even when he's describing how he'll dismantle a contractor's entire life for a 2-day delay, it's like velvet. Velvet wrapped around a hand grenade, Imani countered, though her own heart was doing a frantic rhythm against her ribs that had nothing to do with deadlines. Han Yi-kyung. The name alone made her pulse spike in ways that were dangerously unprofessional. She had spent 4 years as his iron secretary, maintaining a mask of flawless poise and cold structural logic while secretly memorizing the way his jaw tightened when he was deep in thought. "Oh, please, Imani," Maya said, leaning forward with a knowing smirk. "You can't tell us you don't feel it. The tension in that 50-minute briefing could have powered the city's entire power grid." "There is no tension," Imani lied, the words tasting like copper in her mouth. "There is only a highly efficient employment contract and the understanding that he is a man who speaks softly but controls everything." "Efficient?" Jordan laughed. "Imani, the man calls you at 3 in the morning just to hear your opinion on the structural integrity of a bridge he hasn't even bought yet. That's not a contract. That's an obsession." Imani looked down at the phone she just tossed onto her desk, a traitorous warmth spreading through her chest despite the cold danger of the man on the other side of the screen. She had no idea that while she was trying to rebuild her professional armor, the timer on the screen hadn't actually stopped, and the glacier was still listening. "Hello, family. Before we continue, I would like to know where you are watching from. Drop it in the comments and also subscribe to this channel if you are new here." Now let's go back into the story. Digital numbers on Imani's smartphone remained frozen at 50:02, a glowing green indictment of her own carelessness. She stared at the screen, her breath hitching in her throat as the realization of her mistake began to settle like a cold weight in her stomach. The briefing was over. The multi-billion-dollar waterfront development plans were finalized, and her team was already exhaling the tension of an hour spent under the verbal thumb of Han Yi-kyung. "Jordan, I'm serious," Imani said, her voice dropping that practiced, professional edge she used with the Han Syndicate. She leaned back in her chair, oblivious to the fact that the secure line was still drawing data. "If I have to spend one more late-night session pretending that the way he says my name doesn't make my skin crawl in the best possible way, I'm going to lose my mind." Maya chuckled, oblivious as she gathered her tablet. "The Iron Secretary has a crack in her armor. I thought you were immune to the glacier." "I wish," Imani whispered, the confession tumbling out with a raw honesty that felt like a physical relief after 4 years of silence. "But it's not just the power. It's the way he looks at a blueprint like he's seeing the soul of a building. It's the way he remembers that I hate fluorescent lighting and always ensures the conference rooms are dimmed before I arrive. I'm not just loyal to the boss, Maya. I'm irrevocably in love with the man who quoted Korean poetry to me at 3:00 a.m. while we were debating steel reinforcements." The studio went silent, the kind of heavy, pressurized silence that precedes a storm. Imani's team stared at her, their eyes widening, but they weren't looking at her face. They were looking at the mahogany table where her phone sat, the screen pulsing with a soft, rhythmic light that indicated an active audio feed. Imani's heart didn't just skip a beat. It seemed to stop entirely as her vision tunneled toward the device. She lunged for the phone, her fingers trembling so violently she nearly knocked it to the floor. But before her thumb could find the end call button, a sound cut through the room, a low, controlled breath that vibrated through the speaker and into her very bones. Continue, Miss Rousseau, the voice said. It was dark, melodic, and carried the terrifying chill of a winter midnight. It was the voice of Han Yi-kyung. I find your analysis of my late-night habits far more illuminating than the waterfront briefing. Imani froze, her hand hovering inches above the glass screen. Around her, the office transformed into a motionless tableau. Maya's hand was halfway to her mouth, and Jordan looked as though he were ready to bolt for the elevator. Heat flooded Imani's face, a searing crimson tide that burned against her rich brown skin as her professional world collapsed into ash. Sir, she started, her voice a fragile shadow of its usual self. I didn't realize the line. I'm listening, Imani, Yi-kyung interrupted, his tone shifting from cold observation to something predatory and intense. Don't hang up. Don't you dare try to explain this away as office banter. You were speaking about the soul of a building. You were speaking about me. Imani closed her eyes, pressing the phone to her ear as if the physical connection could help her withstand the weight of his attention. The iron secretary was gone, replaced by a woman whose secret had been ripped into the light. How much did you hear? She whispered, the question barely more than a jagged breath. Enough to know that our current contract is no longer sufficient for what I have in mind, Yi-kyung replied. There was a rustle of silk on the other end, the sound of a man rising from an expensive leather chair. You said you'd rather be indispensable than reachable. You've succeeded. My driver is already downstairs. Don't be late, Imani. We have a different kind of project to discuss. The line went dead with a soft click, leaving Imani staring at her ghost-like reflection in the black glass. She had spent years building walls that were structurally sound, only to realize she had accidentally handed the glacier the blueprints to her heart. The black sedan was a silent, predatory shadow moving through the rain-slicked streets of Seoul. Inside, Imani sat stiffly, the leather seat feeling more like an interrogation chair than a luxury convenience. She stared out the window, watching her independence recede as the car climbed the winding roads toward the exclusive peaks of Seongbukdong. Beside her, Han Yi-kyung was a mountain of quiet, terrifying gravity. He hadn't said a word since she stepped into the car, but the air between them was thick, charged with the lingering echoes of her accidental confession. When the vehicle finally pulled into the courtyard of his sprawling estate, a brutalist masterpiece of concrete, glass, and dark timber, Yi-kyung finally moved. He didn't wait for the driver. He stepped out and opened Imani's door himself, his hand extending toward her. The gold rings on his fingers glinted under the exterior floodlights, and for a moment, Imani saw the tattoos on his hand not as symbols of violence, but as a map of the man she had foolishly allowed herself to love. Follow me, he commanded, his voice a low vibration that settled in her chest. He led her through the grand foyer to a secondary wing of the house. He stopped before a set of heavy, brushed metal doors and pressed his thumb to a biometric scanner. The doors hissed open to reveal a workspace that took Imani's breath away. It was a mirror of her own studio, but elevated to an impossible degree. High-end drafting tables, the latest 3D rendering hardware, and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city were all bathed in the soft, warm light he knew she preferred. Your new office, Yi-kyung said, stepping into the room behind her. And your bedroom is through the suite to the left. You'll find your personal belongings have already been transferred. Imani spun around, her heart hammering against her ribs. Transferred? Sir, I agreed to a meeting, not a kidnapping. I have a life. I have a firm to run. Yi-kyung stepped closer, his presence effectively shrinking the massive room. You have a target on your back, Imani. My intelligence suggests the Iron Lotus has identified you as my strategic pillar. If they want to dismantle the Han Syndicate, they start by removing the architect who designs my infrastructure. You are no longer safe in a glass-walled studio in Gangnam. Imani searched his face, looking for the glacier she had served for 4 years. But his eyes were different tonight, darker, more focused, and burning with a possessive heat that made her knees weak. Is this about my safety, or is this about what you heard on that call? Yi-kyung didn't flinch. He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a touch so light it felt like a brand. Does it matter? The result is the same. You are under my protection now. You will work from here. You will eat here. You will sleep here. This is a prison, she whispered, though her pulse betrayed her, thudding rhythmically against his skin. It is a sanctuary, he corrected, his voice dropping to a predatory silkiness. One built specifically for you. You said you were irrevocably in love with me, Imani. Consider this the first phase of our new contract. I have spent years watching you build walls for me. Now I am going to see what it's like to live inside them with you. He stepped back, the cold mask of the Mafia boss sliding back into place, but the intensity in his gaze remained. He handed her a slim, black tablet. The security protocols are already active. You can't leave the grounds without my personal authorization. Your team has been told you are on a high-security sabbatical for the waterfront project. Imani looked at the tablet, then at the man who had effectively stolen her freedom with a single sentence. She was the Iron Secretary, a woman who understood structures and foundations better than anyone. She could see the bars of this gilded cage, but as Yi Kaiyang turned to leave, his silhouette framed by the flickering lights of the city he controlled, she realized the most terrifying truth of all. She didn't want to break out. Yi Kaiyang, she called out, using his name for the first time without a title. He paused at the door, his head tilting slightly. The Iron Lotus, she said, her voice regaining a ghost of its professional edge. Are they really coming for me, or is this just the only way you knew how to keep me? Yi Kaiyang didn't turn around. In my world, Imani, there is very little difference between a threat and a desire. Sleep well. We begin the new blueprints in the morning. The doors hissed shut, the magnetic locks engaging with a definitive click that echoed through the silent, luxurious suite. Imani stood alone in her new empire, surrounded by the tools of her trade and the scent of the man who had finally heard her heart and responded by claiming her entire world. The first 3 days of Imani's confinement were a blur of restless drafting and high-tension silence. Though she was provided with every luxury imaginable, the weight of the glacier's presence felt heavier here than it ever had in the office. Yi Kaiyang was a ghost in his own home, appearing only as a shadow in the hallway or a deep, resonant voice on the other side of her door, checking on the progress of the waterfront blueprints. By the 4th night, the walls of her high-tech sanctuary began to feel like they were closing in. Imani needed to move, to breathe, to understand the man who had effectively stolen her life under the guise of protection. Armed with the restless energy of a woman who built structures to withstand storms, she slipped out of her suite. The estate was a labyrinth of dark stone and brushed steel, a physical manifestation of Yi Kaiyang's mind, ordered, impenetrable, and cold. She wandered into the lower levels, past the private gym and the wine cellar, until she reached a corridor that wasn't on the digital floor plans Yi Kaiyang had provided. At the end of the hall stood a single door, distinct from the others. It was made of warm, reclaimed oak, a jarring contrast to the rest of the brutalist mansion. The biometric scanner glowed a soft, inviting blue. On a whim, Imani pressed her thumb to the glass. To her shock, the lock disengaged with a welcoming chime. The door swung open to reveal not a dark room of Mafia secrets, but a cathedral of light and paper. Imani stepped inside, her breath catching in her throat as she realized she had walked into a mirror of her own mind. The walls were covered from floor to ceiling with sketches, elevations, and site plans, but they weren't the syndicate's industrial projects. These were her designs, the ones she had drawn in the dead of night, the passion projects she had hidden in private folders, the dream structures she thought would never see the light of day. There was the sustainable orphanage she'd envisioned for the outskirts of Nairobi. There was the glass-domed library she'd sketched during a bout of insomnia 3 years ago. In the center of the room sat a massive white oak table, and on it stood a physical, 3D printed model of her Solace Tower, a radical, forest-integrated skyscraper that every major firm in Seoul had rejected as financially impossible. Imani moved toward the model, her fingers trembling as she touched the delicate resin balconies. Beside the model lay a stack of legal documents. She flipped through them, her heart racing. They were construction permits, land deeds, and funding allocations. Yi Kaiyang hadn't just been hoarding her art. He had been quietly buying up the land, securing the permits, and funneling his own private wealth into a foundation titled the Rousseau Legacy. I told you once that I valued your eyes, Imani. A voice rasped from the doorway. She spun around. Yi Kaiyang stood there, his blazer discarded and his sleeves rolled up, revealing the dark, intricate ink that spiraled down his forearms. He didn't look like a boss or a criminal kingpin in that moment. He looked like a man standing in a shrine. "You've been funding these," she whispered, gesturing to the room. "The library, the orphanage, the tower, these have nothing to do with the syndicate." "The syndicate is what I do to survive," Yi Kyung said, stepping into the room. The soft light of the studio caught the sharp line of his jaw. "This is what I do to watch you live. You think I kept you near me just for the work. I kept you because you see a world that isn't broken, and I wanted to be the one to build it for you." Imani looked from the blueprints to the man who had sabotaged her career just to ensure he was the only one who could provide the canvas for her genius. The betrayal stung, sharp and bitter, but beneath it was a terrifying, overwhelming realization. He hadn't just heard her confession on the phone. He had been answering it in secret for years. "You're a monster," she murmured, even as she stepped toward him, drawn by the gravity of his honesty. "I am," he agreed, his dark eyes never leaving hers. "But I am a monster who has built a kingdom for his architect. Tell me, Imani, now that you've seen the foundation, are you brave enough to build the rest with me?" The tension in the room was no longer about blueprints or masonry. It was the structural collapse of 4 years of professional lies, leaving them both standing in the wreckage of their own desires. The transition from the secluded sanctuary of the oak-paneled studio to the cold, crystalline brilliance of the Seoul Grand Ballroom felt like a descent into a beautiful, high-stakes war zone. Imani stood before the full-length mirror in her suite, the silk of her gown, a deep, shimmering emerald that complemented the rich mahogany of her skin, clinging to her like a second skin. It was a dress meant for a queen or a target. "The Iron Lotus will be watching for a weakness," Yi Kyung's voice cut through her reflection as he stepped into the room. He looked lethal in a custom black tuxedo, the ink on his neck partially veiled by his starched collar, though nothing could hide the predatory grace of his movements. He walked toward her, his reflection looming behind hers, and draped a heavy necklace of uncut diamonds around her neck. "Tonight, you aren't my secretary. You aren't even my architect. You are the woman I would burn this city down for. If you play your part, the man who betrayed our supply lines will move to strike. He won't be able to help himself." "And if I don't play it well?" Imani asked, her hands steady as she adjusted the stones. Yi Kyung leaned down, his lips brushing the curve of her shoulder, a gesture that was half performance and half possession. "You've spent 4 years building structures that can't be broken, Imani. Just build this lie the same way." The gala was a sea of silk, champagne, and whispered malice. As they entered, the room seemed to tilt in their direction. The glacier was no longer solitary. He was anchored by a woman who walked with her head high, her hand resting with practiced ease on his forearm. For years. Imani had walked 5 steps behind him, a shadow with a tablet. Tonight, she was the center of his orbit. Every time Yi Kyung leaned in to whisper a private joke, every time his hand lingered at the small of her back, Imani felt a terrifying thrill. It wasn't just the adrenaline of the trap they were setting. It was the intoxicating weight of the power he shared with her. When the city's elite looked at her, they no longer saw a brilliant employee. They saw a woman who had tamed a monster. "You're enjoying this," Yi Kyung murmured into her ear as they circled the dance floor. His grip on her waist was firm, pulling her flush against the hard planes of his chest. "I'm playing the part," she countered, though the heat in her cheeks wasn't from the wine. "Your pulse says otherwise," he rasped. "You like that they're afraid of you now. You like that you are the only person in this room I won't kill." The realization hit her harder than any physical blow. She did like it. She liked the way the elders of rival syndicates bowed a little lower when she looked at them. She liked the silent communication between her and Yi Kyung, the way a single glance from her could steer his temper or command his attention. The trap sprung near the balcony. Director O, a man Imani had always suspected of greed, approached them with a glass of champagne and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He spoke of shifting tides and new alliances, his eyes darting to Imani with a mixture of lust and condescension. "A beautiful distraction, Yi Kyung," O sneered, his voice oily. "But a distraction nonetheless. Does she know you're losing the waterfront because you're too busy playing house?" Imani didn't wait for Yi Kyung to speak. She stepped forward, her voice like cold marble. "Director O, the waterfront isn't being lost. It's being redesigned to ensure that parasites like you can't find a crack in the foundation. If you had spent as much time reading the latest structural reports as you did meeting with the Iron Lotus in Incheon, you'd know you've already been locked out of the accounts. The color drained from O's face. He looked at Yi Kyung, expecting a reprimand for a secretary speaking out of turn, but he found only a dark, satisfied smirk. Yi Kyung stepped up behind Imani, his presence a silent, towering wall of support. "She's the architect, Oh," Yi Kyung said, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "She knows where all the bodies are buried because she's the one who designed the tombs." As Oh was led away by two of Yi Kyung's silent shadows, Imani felt a rush of pure, unadulterated triumph. She looked up at Yi Kyung, the pretense of the devoted lover, blurring into something dangerously real. She had tasted the power of his world, and as he led her back toward the car, her hand remained locked in his, no longer because the script required it, but because she was beginning to realize that the glacier's throne was the only seat she ever wanted to occupy. The ride back from the gala was silent, but the air inside the Maybach was no longer cold. It was thick, heavy with the unsaid truths of the night. Imani leaned her head against the cool leather, watching the neon lights of Seoul blur into streaks of electric blue and white. The adrenaline of the confrontation with Director O was beginning to fade, replaced by a gnawing question that had been eating at her since she stepped into the hidden oak-paneled studio. Yi Kyung sat beside her, his silhouette sharp and imposing against the city lights. He had loosened his tie, the top buttons of his shirt undone to reveal the dark ink of a tiger's coil resting against his collarbone. He looked less like a king and more like a man who was weary of his own crown. "How did you find them?" Imani asked softly, her voice breaking the stillness. "The designs in that room, some of those were on private servers. One was in a physical portfolio I thought I lost during my move 2 years ago." Yi Kyung didn't turn to look at her, but his jaw tightened. "You didn't lose it, Imani. My men recovered it from the sidewalk after your taxi was cut off by a rival crew. I told myself I was just securing your data, but then I opened it." Imani felt a prickle of unease. "And the job offers? 4 years ago, before I signed your permanent contract, I was shortlisted for the Foster Plus Partners firm in London. I had an interview with the Dubai Urban Commission. All of them went cold. I thought I just wasn't good enough." The car glided into the estate's driveway, the engine cutting out with a soft purr. Yi Kyung finally turned to her. In the dim light of the cabin, his eyes weren't glacial. They were hollow, reflecting a desperate kind of honesty. "You were more than good enough," he rasped. "You were the best candidate they had ever seen. I know because I was the one who made sure those firms received anonymous tips about structural liabilities in their current projects, threats that would only vanish if they retracted your offer. I was the ghost in your inbox, Imani. I was the reason every door closed until the only one left open was mine." Imani felt the world tilt. The iron secretary persona she had built was predicated on the idea that she had earned her place through sheer, grit-fueled competence. To hear that her path had been paved by a predator's obsession felt like a structural collapse. "You sabotaged my life," she whispered, her hand moving to the door handle. "You trapped me before I even knew you existed." "I was a coward," Yi Kyung said, his hand catching her wrist before she could pull the lever. His grip wasn't violent, but it was absolute. "I had spent my life surrounded by people who wanted my head or my throne. Then you walked in for that first interview, smelling of jasmine and structural ink, looking at me like I was just another puzzle to be solved. I realized within 10 minutes that if you left that office, I wouldn't be able to breathe in it anymore. I couldn't lose the only thing that made me feel like a man instead of a weapon. So you made me a prisoner before the first day of work," Imani countered, her eyes stinging. "All those late nights, the midnight calls, you were just guarding your prize." "No," Yi Kyung stepped out of the car and pulled her with him, leading her toward the edge of the estate's infinity pool that overlooked the shimmering valley. "I was trying to find a way to make you stay by choice. Every design I funded, every permit I bought in secret, I was building a world where you didn't need me anymore, hoping that by the time it was finished, you wouldn't want to leave." He stepped into her space, his forehead dropping to touch hers. The smell of his expensive cologne and the faint metallic scent of the city clung to him. "I am a monster, Imani. I've lived in the dark for so long that I forgot how to ask for something without taking it. But that night on the phone, when I heard you say you loved me, I realized I didn't just sabotage your career. I sabotaged my own soul. Imani looked at him, seeing the raw, bleeding truth behind the glacier's mask. He had built a gilded cage, yes, but he had spent 4 years trying to turn it into a kingdom for her. The betrayal was massive, but the devotion was deeper. I should hate you, she murmured, her fingers curling into the fabric of his tuxedo. You should, he agreed, his breath warm against her lips. But you're the architect. You know that sometimes you have to burn a structure to the ground before you can build something that actually lasts. As they stood on the precipice of the city they both controlled in different ways, the silence between them was no longer a professional boundary. It was the sound of a foundation settling, uneven, dangerous, but finally, undeniably real. The storm that had been brewing over Seoul finally broke, lashing the floor-to-ceiling glass of the estate with a violent, rhythmic fury. Inside the studio, the air was thick with the scent of rain, expensive espresso, and the sharp, ozone tang of high-end electronics. It was 2:45 a.m., the witching hour where Imani usually did her best work, but tonight, the lines on the digital blueprint before her wouldn't stay straight. Yi Kyung was seated at the secondary drafting table, his presence a heavy, grounding anchor in the dim room. He had shed his waistcoat hours ago, his white dress shirt rolled up to the elbows, revealing the intricate black ink of a dragon that seemed to coil and flex as he moved his pen. They were supposed to be finalizing the structural fail-safes for the Solace Tower, but the silence between them was no longer professional. It was a live wire, humming with the electricity of his confession from the night before. The cantilever on the 42nd floor is still off by 3 millimeters, Imani murmured, her voice raspy from hours of disuse. She didn't look up, but she could feel his gaze tracing the line of her neck. 3 millimeters is a rounding error for most architects, Yi Kyung said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that sent a shiver down her spine. I'm not most architects, and you're not a man who accepts rounding errors. She heard the soft creak of his chair as he stood up. He walked toward her, his movements slow and deliberate, until he was standing directly behind her. The heat radiating from his body was a physical force, a contrast to the chill of the storm outside. He leaned over, his chest brushing her shoulder as he reached out to the touchscreen console. Here, he whispered, his breath warm against the shell of her ear. His hand covered hers on the glass, his long, scarred fingers guiding her touch to recalibrate the structural load. If you reinforce the central spine with a diamond-weave carbon, the error disappears. Imani froze, the feeling of his skin against hers, the rough texture of his calluses and the steady weight of his hand, shattered the last of her iron secretary composure. For 4 years, she had meticulously planned for every structural failure, every potential collapse. But she hadn't planned for this. She hadn't planned for the way her heart would hammer against her ribs like a trapped bird. She turned her head slightly, intended to thank him, but found his face inches from hers. The unreadable glacier mask was gone. In its place was a man who looked vulnerable, his eyes searching hers with a raw, desperate hunger. Imani, he rasped, her name sounding like a prayer and a plea. Stop looking at the screen, look at me. She finally let the digital pen fall from her hand. It hit the floor with a soft clatter that echoed through the vast room. I've been looking at you for 4 years, Yi Kyung. I've looked at you across boardrooms, through car mirrors, and over the tops of thousands of pages of contracts. I've looked at you until I can see you even when I close my eyes. Yi Kyung's hand moved from the console to her waist, pulling her upward as she stood. He didn't use the force of a mafia boss. He used the trembling hesitation of someone who was terrified he was about to wake up from a dream. He cupped her face, his thumbs brushing over her cheekbones, his touch reverent. I spent my whole life building a fortress so no one could get in, he whispered, his forehead dropping to rest against hers. I thought if I was strong enough, I wouldn't need anyone. But then you started building things, beautiful, impossible things, and I realized my fortress wasn't a defense, it was a tomb, and I was just waiting for you to walk in and wake me up. Imani felt a tear escape, tracing a path through the rich brown of her skin. She reached up, her fingers tangling in his jet-black hair, pulling him closer. You're a monster who sabotaged my life, she whispered against his lips. I am, he agreed, his voice breaking. And I'm a fool who fell for him. When he finally kissed her, It wasn't the polished, dominant performance of the gala. It was a structural collapse. It was the sound of 1,000 glass walls shattering at once. It was desperate, messy, and real. In the heart of the storm, surrounded by the blueprints of a future they were both terrified to claim, the boss and the secretary finally ceased to exist. There was only the heat of their skin, the salt of her tears, and the terrifying realization that they were no longer two separate entities, but a single, precarious foundation built on the most dangerous ground of all: the truth. The stillness that followed their shared vulnerability was shattered not by a sound, but by a sudden, sickening drop in the room's ambient temperature. The climate control system, a marvel of engineering Imani had personally vetted, hummed a discordant note before dying completely. Then, the lights didn't just flicker, they were snuffed out, plunged into a vacuum of absolute darkness. Yi Kaiyang was moving before the first emergency red light could pulse to life. In one fluid motion, he pivoted, his arms sweeping Imani behind the solid oak drafting table just as the floor-to-ceiling glass. The reinforced, triple-paned barrier she had believed was invincible, imploded. The sound was like a thunderclap inside a drum. Shards of crystalline glass rained down, sparkling like diamonds in the rhythmic red strobe of the alarm. The wind of the storm roared into the studio, bringing with it the scent of wet asphalt and the ozone tang of high-voltage disruption. "Iron Lotus," Yi Kaiyang hissed, his voice stripped of the warmth of the previous hour, replaced by a cold, metallic precision. He pulled a compact handgun from a hidden holster at the small of his back, his thumb clicking the safety off. "The security grid," Imani whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. "It's decentralized. It shouldn't be possible to cut the feed to this wing without triggering the lockdown." "They didn't cut it," Yi Kaiyang said, his eyes scanning the gaping hole in his sanctuary. Shadows were already detached from the darkness outside, black-clad figures rappelling from the roof with lethal, silent grace. "They bypassed it. Someone gave them the frequency for the structural resonant dampeners. They didn't break the glass, they made it vibrate until it ceased to exist." A burst of suppressed gunfire chewed into the mahogany table above their heads, sending splinters flying like shrapnel. Imani felt a strange, detached clarity wash over her. This was her building. She knew every weight-bearing beam, every concealed conduit, and every flaw the builders thought they had hidden. "We're trapped," she realized, her eyes darting to the heavy metal doors. "If the primary grid is down, the magnetic locks are in fail-secure mode. Even you can't get us out of here without a hardwired override." "Then we make a stand," Yi Kaiyang replied. He looked at her, his dark hair disheveled and his white shirt stained with drafting ink and glass dust. In the flickering red light, the dragon on his arm looked like it was breathing. "I spent 4 years keeping you in a box, Imani. I never thought I'd be the one to hand the key to my enemies." Another volley of gunfire shattered a row of 3D-printed models, the resin's Solace Tower. She had spent weeks perfecting disintegrating into white powder. Yi Kaiyang returned fire, the bark of his weapon deafening in the enclosed space. He was a king fighting for his life, but Imani could see the math in his eyes. There were too many of them, and they were pinned down in a room designed for creation, not combat. "Yi Kaiyang, look at me," Imani commanded, her voice cutting through the chaos with a sudden, sharp authority. She reached out, grabbing the lapel of his shirt and pulling him close. "You told me you funded my dreams because I saw a world that wasn't broken. But you forgot one thing about architects." He ducked as a grenade skittered across the floor, its metallic clink a death knell. He threw himself over her, shielding her body with his own as the blast rocked the room, sending a wave of heat and dust over them. "What?" he gasped, his ears ringing. "We don't just build," she said, her eyes flashing with a cold, tactical fire he had never seen before. "We know exactly how much pressure it takes to make everything come crashing down." She reached beneath the drafting table, her fingers finding a small, recessed panel that wasn't on any official blueprint. It was a secret she had kept even from him, a private kill switch she had designed into the very foundation of the estate as her ultimate exit strategy. She had built this gilded cage, and she was the only one who knew where the ghost threads were hidden. "You wanted to see what it was like to live inside my walls?" Imani asked, a dark, determined smile touching her lips. "Hold on, I'm about to redesign the floor plan. The secondary explosion of the grenade had filled the air with pulverized concrete and the acrid scent of burnt circuitry, but within the shroud of dust, Imani was a pillar of absolute, terrifying focus. Yi Kyung gripped his weapon, ready to surge forward into a suicidal line of fire to protect her, but Imani's hand on his arm was like a vice. It wasn't the touch of a secretary seeking comfort. It was the grip of an officer taking command. "Don't move," she commanded, her voice cutting through the ringing in his ears. She didn't look at the invaders. She looked only at the small, recessed panel she had pried open beneath the oak table. Inside was a keypad that didn't connect to the estate's mainframe. It was a closed-loop system, a ghost circuit she had installed during the foundation pour, back when she still believed she might one day need to bury Han Yi Kyung inside his own dreams. Her fingers flew across the keys with a percussionist's rhythm. "You call me the Iron Secretary because I handle your logistics," she whispered, the red emergency light reflecting in her wide, fierce eyes. "But you forgot that before I was your secretary, I was a structural saboteur. I don't just build, Yi Kyung. I calculate the exact moment of failure." The lead assassin of the Iron Lotus stepped through the shattered window, his suppressed rifle leveled at the drafting table. He was a professional, moving with a predator's confidence, but he didn't realize he was standing on a pressure-sensitive plate Imani had designated as a dead zone 3 years ago. Imani hit the final sequence, enter. The floor didn't just vibrate, it groaned with the sound of tectonic plates shifting. A series of heavy, reinforced titanium shutters, hidden behind the decorative stone pillars, slammed down with the force of a guillotine, sealing the shattered windows in a fraction of a second. The invaders were no longer entering, they were trapped. "What is this?" Yi Kyung asked, his eyes wide as he watched the room transform. "Structural isolation," Imani replied, her voice cold and melodic. She turned a dial on the panel. Suddenly, the very floor beneath the Iron Lotus team tilted. The high-polished marble tiles retracted, revealing a pneumatic pit designed to drop into the estate's reinforced basement vault. 3 of the assassins vanished into the dark with muffled shouts before the floor snapped shut again, locking them in a soundproof tomb. The remaining 2 invaders opened fire, but Imani was already moving. She grabbed a heavy glass paperweight from the table, a model of the Burj Khalifa, and threw it with a practiced, low-gravity arc. It wasn't meant to hit them. It struck a specific sensor on the ceiling. Instantly, the high-pressure fire suppression system didn't spray water. It released a concentrated burst of halon gas into the localized corner where the gunmen stood. They collapsed in seconds, their lungs deprived of oxygen before they could even scream. Silence returned to the studio, broken only by the heavy, ragged breathing of the 2 people left standing in the wreckage. Yi Kyung lowered his gun, staring at the woman beside him as if seeing a ghost. The glacier was frozen, not by fear, but by the sheer, lethal brilliance of the woman he thought he had been protecting. "You built kill switches into my home," he rasped, the realization sinking in. "Every building I commissioned. You built a way to destroy it from the inside." Imani stood up, brushing the white dust of the Solace Tower model from her emerald gown. She looked at him, not as his secretary, and not as his victim. She looked at him as an equal who had finally revealed her teeth. "I built them as an exit strategy, Yi Kyung," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Because I knew that one day your world would come for me. I just didn't realize until tonight that I'd be using them to save you instead of leaving you." The tattoos on Yi Kyung's hand stood out starkly against his pale skin as he reached out, not to restrain her, but to touch the hand that had just dismantled an elite strike team with a few keystrokes. "You're not just an architect," he whispered, a dark, reverent smile touching his lips. "You're the most dangerous thing I've ever let into my life. And you're the only man I'd burn my exit strategy for," she countered. Outside, the storm continued to howl, but inside the sealed, silent fortress of the studio, the power dynamic had shifted permanently. The gilded contract was dead. In its place was something far more volatile, a partnership of 2 monsters who had finally found a reason to stop fighting the world and start rebuilding it. The silence that followed the clinical efficiency of Imani's defense was more profound than any noise the storm could produce. The halon gas had cleared, vented out by the emergency systems, leaving the studio smelling of ozone and spent potential. Yi Kaiyang stood amidst the wreckage of his sanctuary, looking not at the fallen assassins or the reinforced shutters, but at Imani. She was still draped in emerald silk, dusted with the white powder of her destroyed models, looking like a goddess of creation who had briefly, flawlessly, pivoted into destruction. He didn't speak as he crossed the room. He went to the heavy, wall-mounted safe behind his primary desk, a vault Imani had always assumed held the syndicate's liquid assets or blackmail files. With steady hands, he entered a code and withdrew 2 items, a thick, leather-bound ledger and a stack of notarized legal documents. He walked back to the oak drafting table, clearing a space among the blueprints. He laid the documents down with a solemnity that felt like a religious rite. "The Iron Lotus didn't come here because they thought I was weak," Yi Kaiyang said, his voice resonant in the quiet room. "They came because they heard I was liquidating. They knew I was preparing to cut the cord, and they wanted to catch the glacier before he melted." Imani looked down at the papers. Her breath caught. It was a complete transfer of the Han Syndicate's legitimate construction and architectural holdings. Every crane, every skyscraper, every acre of land, all of it was being signed over to a new entity, Rauso Architectural Group. "What is this, Yi Kaiyang?" she whispered, her fingers tracing her own name on the deed. "Your independence," he replied. "You said I sabotaged your career to keep you near me. You were right. It was the act of a man who didn't know how to build a life, only how to hold a territory. This is my apology. These holdings are yours, untainted by the syndicate's shadow. They are the legitimate foundation you should have had 4 years ago." He then picked up the leather-bound ledger, the black book that held the names, debts, and sins of half the city's underworld. It was the only thing keeping the rival families from tearing each other apart, and the only thing keeping Yi Kaiyang tethered to the darkness. Without a word, he pulled a silver lighter from his pocket. The flame flickered, reflecting in his dark, resolute eyes. He touched the fire to the edge of the paper. Imani watched, mesmerized, as the names of monsters and the records of a decade of violence curled into black ash. The smell of burning paper filled the room, a funeral pyre for the Mafia boss she had once feared. "You're burning your leverage," she said, her voice trembling. "Without that, you're just a man. They'll come for you." "Let them come," Yi Kaiyang said, dropping the flaming book into a metal waste bin. "I'd rather be a man standing next to you than a king sitting alone on a throne of corpses. I told you I wanted to build a world that wasn't broken. I can't do that while holding onto the tools that broke it." He stepped toward her, his hand reaching out to cup her face. The tattoos on his neck and hands seemed less like warnings now and more like the scars of a life he was finally leaving behind. "The glacier is dead, Imani. All that's left is the man who spent 50 minutes listening to a phone call because he couldn't bear to let go of your voice." Imani looked at the ashes, then at the documents that guaranteed her future, and finally at the man who had risked everything to move from her captor to her partner. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had dissolved. "I'm an architect, Yi Kaiyang," she murmured, leaning into his touch, her hand covering the ink on his forearm. "I don't know how to build normal. I only know how to build things that last." "Then build us something," he rasped, pulling her into a kiss that tasted of smoke, rain, and the terrifying, beautiful freedom of a clean slate. "Build it as high as you want. I'll be the ground you stand on." As the first light of a gray soul morning began to bleed through the edges of the titanium shutters, the Iron Secretary and the Mafia boss were gone. In their place stood 2 people amidst the ruins of their old lives, finally ready to draft a future where the only thing they kept secret was the depth of a love that had survived the collapse. The foundation was laid, the truth was out, and for the first time in 4 years, the call was finally, truly disconnected.